Hello, thank you for joining the webinar. I'm Rob. Today we're going to take a look at a topic you've likely seen in the news recently, GDPR. Perhaps you've seen headlines like these, GDPR, are you ready? Or perhaps you've seen Forbes magazine talk about GDPR. Or maybe you've seen these talking about data privacy, data protection. Or these, focusing on something in Europe. Well, you'll certainly be seeing even more headlines with all of these topics. Why? Because there is a legal deadline approaching later this month. So what exactly is GDPR? Well, as you've likely surmised, it's a new law that will affect websites and their visitors, and not just those in Europe. And I'll tell you about it in greater detail in just a moment. First, let's look at our roadmap for today. So for the next 20 minutes or so, I'll walk you through what GDPR is, where it's located and where it's affecting, the core principles, the requirements for compliance. I'll give you a real-world example and then show you what compliance and preservation looks within that world. And then we'll have we'll finish up with some resources. Okay, one last note before we jump in. This webinar presents an overview of a complex law and its legal requirements. So obviously, our intent is to explain the basics. In the time we have, we can't illuminate every detail, scenario, or possible loophole. Okay? That said, let's get started. So what is GDPR? Well, if you work for a corporation or have a business website or even just an email mailing list that you use to communicate with your clients, GDPR is likely to affect or apply directly to you. GDPR stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. It's a new law created by the European Union that goes into effect in a few weeks on May 25th. More specifically, at its heart, GDPR is an internet privacy law. Now, even though it's an EU law, all corporations, small businesses, and entrepreneurs that use the internet to interact with consumers, and really, are there any that do not? All of them need to be aware and familiar with GDPR because, in many cases, it will mean major changes for any entity that has consumers located in the EU. And that is regardless whether the business is inside the EU or located anywhere else in the world. So now, if you're a small business owner or even someone who just sells items or services via Facebook and are just learning about GDPR, I imagine your head may be spinning about this location stuff. So let's go into this a little bit deeper. The GDPR will apply to any relationship or transaction, whether commercial or free, where one or more of the entities is in the European Union. Now, this is not based on citizenship, it's based on location when a business is interacting with someone or the reverse. Furthermore, any business or marketer based in the European Union must comply with the GDPR across its entire audience. That means if a business is collecting data from someone in the United States or elsewhere, it still has to comply. And if a business or marketer is based outside of the EU, they must comply with the GDPR when they are interacting with or collecting data from people located in the EU. Again, even if it's just transitory. Whew, I know that is a lot. And to make matters more challenging, there are gray areas within all of what I've just spoken about. And unfortunately, they are beyond the scope of what I'm covering here today. But let's get out of the EU location weeds and go back into a higher level look at the intent of GDPR. It's, again, essentially a consumer data protection law. Let's take a look at the core principles. At the right, you can see a representation of some of the legalese. Boiled down to its essence, the intent of the GDPR is to allow individuals to access their personal data, export their personal data, correct errors in their personal data, object to the processing of their personal data, and erase their personal data. So the GDPR applies to the acquisition, storage, processing, and protection of personal data. In other words, it covers everything done with all of the data collected from individuals from initial gathering to final deletion and at every point in between. Emphasizing, this law pertains specifically and exclusively to personal data. That is, anything that is associated with or related to someone who is identified or who can be identified. So what do we mean by personal data? Examples of personal data are certainly obvious ones. Names, email addresses, physical addresses are a few examples. There are many more. And there are less obvious ones, such as IP addresses and cookies and other information that is collected automatically, usually by common tools such as Google Analytics. Still deeper, GDPR really applies to any type of personal information you would put in a client or contact database. This could be information that you collect automatically through an opt-in or any other collection method, or through tagging or segmenting your database. These activities are included because you are effectively monitoring what people are doing. So that's a look at the central construct of the law. Now let's look at what the law requires businesses to do to comply with GDPR. So there are three areas of requirements. The first, controls and notifications, says businesses will need to protect personal data using appropriate security, notify authorities of personal data breaches, obtain appropriate consents for processing data, and keep records detailing data processing. Second, organizations are required to have transparent policies. They must provide clear notice of data collection. They must outline processing purposes and use cases. And they need to define data retention and deletion policies. Third and last, IT and training. Large businesses will need to train privacy personnel and employees, audit and update data policies, possibly employ a data protection officer if it's required, and create and manage compliant vendor contracts. Yes, some of these requirements are intended for larger businesses and corporations. For more specifics, I will point you towards some resources in just a few minutes. But for now, let's leave the legalese behind and look at a real-world example of what GDPR means for the marketing activities of small and individual businesses. So let's say you offer a free video demo or white paper to anyone who provides their email address. Pretty common occurrence for many of us. It looks like this, right? You ask for their email, they give it, you give them a freebie. You have a prospect added to your email list, they have some valuable free information. Good trade, right? And you also have an effective lead magnet going there. With the new standard that is GDPR, that's gone. You cannot automatically capture each and everyone who clicks through a lead magnet on your marketing email list. The only way allowed to add a prospect to your marketing email list under the GDPR would be through consent. And the law requires that their consent is freely given, specific, and unambiguous. So you need to get separate consent to add them to your email marketing list. Furthermore, you can't require them to give this consent as a condition for a freebie. Pretty challenging. Now, an important note, this new consent standard applies to all existing lists. Beginning May 25th, you can no longer email anyone who has not given this specific consent. We're talking about marketing emails, not person-to-person emails, remember. Now, I say anyone because you cannot know if a particular non-EU prospect is currently located in the European Union. Remember, they could simply be traveling through. But wait, there's more. The GDPR also prohibits asking singly for consent to add them to the email list. You're going to need a standalone consent. Also, you cannot do an implied consent. For example, adding a checkbox and requiring its selection to allow the delivery of the freebie. So what do you do to comply? Let's take a look. Remember, your goal is to get compliant and preserve your existing list. First, in advance of the deadline, your goal is to build goodwill by using campaigns aimed at procuring GDPR compliant consents. And here's how. For non-EU businesses, segment your list into two parts. One by non-European Union subscribers, and then one by subscribers from the EU plus any unknowns. You need to consider the unknowns as if they are in the EU. Note that many email service providers can do this for you or will soon be able to. Now, once your lists are segmented, continue communicating with the first non-EU list, as you have been doing. For the EU/unknowns, you're going to need to re-engage with them repeatedly before May 25th. For example, first promote and deliver extra value. Talk about new available content on your site, or maybe even send it directly, and then send an email specifically addressing GDPR and requesting their specific consent. Now, remember, you need to make sure you have systems in place to migrate those who consent to an EU consent confirmed segment or list. So there's some work involved here. Now, last and most important, because we're talking about consent, on May 24th, you need to delete anyone who has yet to consent. And remember, storing and even deleting their info is technically processing. So actions such as these must be done before May 25th. So this is just one example of common marketing processes and how they can be addressed and reconfigured to work within the edicts of GDPR. So perhaps you're feeling a little panicked. Well, there's an abundance of resources available to you. I'm going to cover a couple specific ones that'll help you in your search for answers that are specific to your small business, your medium-sized business, your corporation, and even perhaps your vendors. So first and obviously, we're going to start with the EU's dedicated GDPR site. Here you will find the law in detail, as well as an FAQ and more resources. If you just go to ec.europa.eu and search on data protection, you'll be able to find this site and start taking in even more details. The second one, believe it or not, is Wikipedia. Not only does its entry do a fine job of covering the law in common language, the references list at the bottom of the page is a real treasure trove of more than 50 articles written about GDPR. Third, look to the services vendors you use. Google, Microsoft, Salesforce, MailChimp, to name a few, they all have GDPR-centric web pages, and they can tell you how GDPR is going to impact your specific relationship with them, how they handle processing, and how they can help you integrate GDPR effectively and efficiently. So, believe it or not, that's all the time we have for today. I hope you have found this GDPR overview helpful. The law and its requirements can be somewhat daunting, obviously.